Great, welcome. Our numbers are ticking up as we speak. My name's Catherine Morris. I am with the Consensus Building Institute, and I'm going to be facilitating the meeting today, which is designed for you to give input to the Climate Council on the issues of rural resilience and adaptation. So glad you could all make it. Hope our group grows as we start this up. Um, as we get started, and to get people just more familiar with the chat, I'm wondering if I could ask everybody to put in the chat where you are calling in from or what you would consider your home base. That'll give us a little bit of an idea of what geographic diversity we have on the call today. So you'll see the chat button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and write into the chat where you're from. That would be helpful. Thanks. While you're doing that, let me just begin by saying that uh, this is part of the process for the Climate Council to gather input on the updating of the Climate Action Plan. And the first step in that process is really in the hands of the subcommittees, like the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee you're going to hear from today. They have been charged with making recommendations to the council on those updates. And all the subcommittees have been holding these input sessions, and so they can hear from you and share with you also what they've been working on so far to get your feedback. So today, we want to know more about how towns in Vermont are dealing with both disaster preparedness and the issue of longer term resilience and adaptation planning. So what kind of strategies, what kind of resources would help you in those areas? So what we're going to do is I'm going to first turn it over to members of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee to give you both background on the process and also to share with you some of the ideas that they've been working on. And then the rest of the meeting is really going to be a conversation with you. I'll provide some guidance when we get to that point in the meeting for how we're going to do that. And until then, I just ask that folks stay muted until we get there, and we'll open it up for your opportunity to weigh in. Andrea, I'm just going to turn it over to you now.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Andrea Wright. I'm the Environmental Policy Manager at the Agency of Transportation, and I am co-chairing the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. I'm just going to take a few minutes to ground everyone in the work of the Council and the subcommittees over the last year or so, the better part of this year. But to start off with some background, as most of you know, in 2020, the Vermont State Legislature passed Act 153. That was the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that called for cutting climate pollution and creating legally binding emission reduction requirements, but it also focused in on developing resilience both in the built and the natural environments. The Global Warming Solutions Act, or the GWSA, also required the creation of a Vermont Climate Council and charged them with developing a climate action plan that would serve as a roadmap to meet the objectives of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so it also called for the establishment of subcommittees. Ultimately, 5 subcommittees were established, and they developed pathways and strategies and actions to address the focus areas of emissions reductions, resilience, and carbon sequestration. And that was what was put into the initial climate action plan that was adopted by the Council in 2021. The Global Warming Solutions Act called for the climate action plan to be updated every 4 years. And so a revised plan is due by July 1st of 2025. And in addition to the focus areas of the 2021 plan, this update will also address public health and housing. We've got some animation here. I've got a lot of clicking to do on this slide. So I mentioned the Climate Council and the subcommittees. There are 3 drafting subcommittees. That's the cross-sector mitigation, the rural resilience and adaptation, and the ag and ecosystems. There's also 2 supporting subcommittees, just transitions and science and data. And we all began meeting as subcommittees in early spring. Early on, it was about understanding the process and the framework for the update. And then throughout the summer, late spring and into early summer, we dug really a lot deeper into the 2021 plan. We started looking for gaps in the existing recommendations. We were looking to understand what progress had been made on the actions in the 2021 plan. We heard from subject matter experts and implementers, and then really by about mid to late summer, depending on the subcommittee, defined our direction for drafting modifications that would help to fill the gaps that we identified. So each subcommittee has been working through task groups, either those that existed based on the drafting of the initial climate action plan, or that were formed based on those recognized gaps. And the task groups have been meeting about every other week since late summer, and even more frequently recently, working to draft revised, updated and new pathway strategies and actions with the goal of providing subcommittee recommendations to the full council by the end of this year. Subcommittees are advisory to the council, so it's the council that will ultimately adopt the final recommendations of a plan. So over the winter and into early spring of next year, the council will work to revise this overall plan, determining which recommendations to move forward and prioritize, and then editing a narrative to match the recommendations. Ultimately, having a final revised plan delivered by July 1st, 2025. So there has been engagement and outreach throughout the revision process. The A&R Action Office, Climate Action Office really has been supporting that process, leading that process, beginning with public kickoff meetings earlier this spring. And now here we are, we're at this critical point in receiving stakeholder input from groups like yourselves. The council is holding 8 input sessions across different subcommittees' subject matter, and those will conclude this month. And then the next formal or really concentrated outreach will be in the spring when the council looks to receive further public input and stakeholder input when the revised plan is drafted. The Global Warming Solutions Act did provide definitions for both resilience and adaptation. Resilience is about the capacity to withstand and recover from climate events and disruptions, and adaptation is reducing the vulnerability to of the natural and built systems. And these definitions, of course, were sort of the basis of the work completed by the Rural Resilience Subcommittee for the 2021 plan. And they continue to serve as the foundation as we look to revise the pathways, strategies, and actions and draft the new plan. So based on the definitions and the charge of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee cited in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that was to focus on the pressures that climate change will impose on rural transportation, electricity, housing, emergency services, the communications infrastructure, and really the difficulty of rural communities in meeting the needs of its citizens. The subcommittee has been focused on evaluating and identifying strategies and programs that will build resilience and prepare the state's communities, the infrastructure, and the economy to adapt to the effects of climate change that we're experiencing now and that we'll continue to experience into the future. And we as a subcommittee have decided our best approach to meet that challenge is through the creation of these 3 task groups. We've got a task group focused on community capacity and planning, and then infrastructure and the built environment, as well as public health. So today, we are here, of course, to hear more from all of you. We want to understand better what support is needed. We want to hear your thoughts about what's needed to build resilience in our communities. learn about your experiences and what is working and what might need to be scaled to sort of replicate those successes. And then over the next 10 or 15 minutes, we'll have several different subcommittee members who will share with you what the task groups have been considering for the 2025 update. And then we'll have a dialogue, like Catherine mentioned. Really, the goal for today is to hear from you. But we're going to start off, and I'll turn it over to Anne for some context setting.
Thank you so much, Andrea. My name's Ann Lawless. I'm a volunteer member of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, and I serve on the Select Board in Wheelock in Caledonia County. So this graph is showing the increase in average annual temps from 1900 to the present day, and this warming is driven by climate change. The latest National Climate Assessment projects that average temperatures in Vermont will increase by 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. Warmer air holds more water, and Vermont will continue to experience more extreme storms and days of heavy precipitation. Average annual precipitation has increased nearly 6 inches since the 1960s, with the largest increases occurring in our more mountainous regions. So increased average annual temps are also causing multi-year droughts, increased risk of wildfire and extreme heat. Next slide, please. Did we miss one? Maybe not. So the climate change, these climate change exacerbated hazards have major impacts on our infrastructure, economy, natural resources, and working lands, as well as our social well-being. So in this slide, you can see that high winds and heavy snow, which are increasing in occurrence due to climate change, cause widespread damage to the grid and power outages, placing our most vulnerable community members at risk without access to electricity to heat or cool homes or power their health devices. Prolonged periods of drought and warm temperatures are causing increased risk and occurrence of wildfires. These images show the fire weather update provided just yesterday, with much of the state at increased fire risk. And at the right, you can see a picture of a recent 74-acre wildfire in Barnard that taxed both municipal and state resources in response. And particulate matter from wildfires has detrimental impacts on our lungs, and those particularly at risk include those who are 65 and older, young children, those with medical issues and pre-existing conditions, and there are other folks who are impacted as well. Recent flooding, which, recent flooding, which many on this call are familiar with, has drastic impacts to our transportation infrastructure, our housing infrastructure, and has lasting impacts on the health and social well-being of our communities. Flooding recovery also taxes municipal, financial, and people capacity, with many leading cleanup, managing volunteers, and supporting residents and businesses in recovery. And of course, droughts can be devastating to farmers, municipal water supplies, and other sectors that rely on stable water. With high temperatures, the occurrence of high heat days is increasing, leading to detrimental impacts on Vermonters' health. As climate change increases the severity and occurrence of climate disasters, it shines a brighter light on both the challenges rural communities have in adapting to disruption, but also how tenacious and committed Vermonters are to their communities. This slide is from a recent graduate study by students from the University of Pennsylvania, focused on flooding impacts in the central Vermont region. It shows how much of the flooding response operations in Plainfield following the flooding this summer were and continue to be run by volunteers. The strong social networks and sense of commitment to community that fuels this volunteer engagement in disaster response and recovery also helps communities come together to make big, impactful changes to make their communities more resilient. of course, these more frequent disasters will put great strain on both the municipal and volunteer resources available. So through the work of this subcommittee and our conversation today, we hope to discuss with you all the challenges and opportunities you all see as we work together to build resilience to climate change in communities across Vermont. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks so much for that context setting. I'll now share, maybe you don't have to actually pin. Can remove it. Yeah, thanks. I'll now share with you all where we're starting from in terms of the focus of this subcommittee and where we're looking at revisions, and then we'll encourage conversation as we move through the rest of these pathways. So you'll see on the slide here 6 pathways that encompass the focus of this subcommittee, of which Andrea provided a high-level introduction to. A pathway is a high-level means of achieving the goals and requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. In this case, and with the focus of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, these goals are related to building resilience to climate change impacts for our communities. The first 5 pathways, numbers 1 through 5 that you see on the slide here, are those that were developed during the drafting of the 2021 Climate Action Plan. These are really serving as the starting point for revisions that are currently underway with the task groups. Through ongoing engagement and input received today and through engagement sessions that have been held over the last month, the subcommittee will be revising the pathways you see on the screen here, as well as the strategies and actions that fall beneath. Broadly, the focus of this subcommittee is on building resilience in communities and the built environment. The subcommittee did decide, as Andrea noted early on, that there was a need to really place a greater emphasis in the next 2025 Climate Action Plan on public health, illuminating a lot of the impacts that Anne just spoke to when it comes to increases in heat and what that means in terms of climate impacts. So a 6th pathway has been added on the slide here that you'll see focused on public health. Next slide, please. So those were the pathways. We're now going to move in with a handful of subcommittee members on getting into the strategies that the subcommittee is focused on revising here. So you'll see in the green box at the top, those are the pathways, which are really those high-level goals. And we'll now also talk about the strategies that are included under each pathway and discuss where we're seeking revisions and your input on those. Strategies are statements of measurable activity or benchmarks that are to be reached in pursuit of a pathway. There are also actions that have been identified as sort of the operational actionable tasks that need to be done to meet the pathways and strategies. Those were shared with you all in an email yesterday if you registered in advance of this meeting. We won't have those on the slides here for you today as we'd be here all day, but do want to encourage you to reference those, that table PDF that was shared with you yesterday if interested in more detail about the actions. So the focus of this particular pathway is on providing the tools, financial and capacity resources to enable municipalities and regions to take on climate planning and climate action implementation as it relates to resilience. You'll see in the 4 strategies highlighted here that the recommendations under this pathway include helping communities conduct vulnerability assessments so they have a better understanding of their climate risks, providing additional and sustainable funding for the implementation of resilience projects, streamlining efforts across the state to leverage best practices, and providing recommendations on how to increase community participation in local government, which we see as a key pillar of what makes communities resilient to climate impacts. The task group working on this pathway is considering combining strategies 1 and 2 to speak more holistically to the resources that are needed, both in terms of capacity and funding to support resilience planning and implementation. Task group is also working on additional actions that strengthen support for regional planning commissions to support hazard mitigation activities and design, and leveraging best practices from other capacity building partners, many of which who are on the call with us today, and we're interested to hear from you. There are key recommendations and revisions that we're building off work that was completed through recommendations from the 2021 Climate Action Plan. One example of that is the completed Municipal Vulnerability Indicator tool, which was a recommendation in the 2021 Climate Action Plan. This is a mapping tool to help municipalities explore and understand their vulnerabilities to climate hazards. And through the development and rollout of that tool, that really helps communities assess their vulnerabilities to climate hazards and think about how to incorporate that into municipal planning. We're thinking about sort of the next steps of how to build off of that work to further support capacity in climate planning and action efforts, and really the conversations that communities are having. And lastly, I'll just say a key need that has been identified through conversations with stakeholders, and we'd love to hear more about this today from you all, has been how to equip local governments with the knowledge of existing programs that help to both reduce emissions and build resilience without overloading their capacities. We're really thinking about how can we better support or provide recommendations to support local governments in communicating existing programs to residents and businesses. This is a theme we're hearing across all of the subcommittees of the Climate Council, and we're hoping that this pathway will capture some key recommendations about how to better do that. Thinking about messaging around existing climate programs that both reduce emissions, such as weatherization, heat pump installation, various tax credits, but also programs related to building resilience, such as programs out of the VEM Hazard Mitigation Program and other rebate and tax credit programs. So interested to hear more from you all about that when we get to discussion, and I'll now pass it over to Anne.
Thanks, Marian. I'm Anne Margolis, and with the Department of Public Service, we are working in sort of the electric planning and regulatory space, but we put out the Comprehensive Energy Plan, so think about all energy sectors. But I come at this from an energy perspective. That's what I bring to this task group as staff support. But this task group is generally looking at all the different types of infrastructure that we all as Vermonters rely on for our personal lives, for our work, for our communities. That includes energy infrastructure, but also transportation infrastructure, roads and bridges, communications infrastructure, whether that's fiber, cell, copper wire, all those different modes of communication, our water and wastewater facilities, sewer, wastewater treatment plants, et cetera, even reservoirs, and also, and then our energy infrastructure. So we have our strategies in the last climate action plan that are divided into kind of 4 different sections. The first one relates to creating the foundation for making investments, especially prioritizing those investments and making the most effective investments with the limited dollars that are available to, if it's in the electric sector, it may be from ratepayers. If it's in some of these other sectors, it may be from taxpayers or it may be private investment. So how do you create plans and the foundation to understand what the most cost-effective or meaningful investments in infrastructure resilience will be? And the other 3 strategies really focus on either making those investments or having practices to respond, survive some of the implications of resilience events, major storms, et cetera, and then being able to quickly recover from them. So strategy number 2 focuses on the ability to be able to respond and recover quickly to disruptions. Part of that's based on planning work. Some of it may be based on infrastructure investments. It also may be based on how you communicate with various partners, whether it's your electric utility, whether it is your road crew. There's communication pathways that can be prepared in advance so that the ability to respond and recover is facilitated. The third strategy in the last climate action plan is really about reducing vulnerabilities of specific facilities. So if you think about your most critical facilities, maybe it's your emergency shelter, maybe it is a specific route into or out of town, maybe it is a certain feeder of the distribution grid, really focusing on what are your specific facilities that you need to keep either powered up or accessible or functional through a major storm or other resilience event. And then the fourth strategy focuses more broadly on all of our infrastructure and how can we increase the efficiency of our infrastructure systems and redundancies in those systems to ensure that if one mode is cut off, that there are backup systems. Our task group at this point is looking at how we can condense some of these strategies really into, we're talking about having sort of the planning framework and then the investment and action framework. And also we have just quite a few actions at this point, some of which are, they're all very important, but some of them can be condensed or maybe don't rise to the level of being called out in the climate action plan as necessary for near-term action or funding. And then, we have representation on our task group right now from energy and transportation, but we don't necessarily have as much direct input on the water and wastewater front, although we've been seeking out assistance from agencies and partners in that to help us out, and on the communications front. So we would be especially interested in any input from folks today in those areas where we don't have direct representation: water, wastewater, and communications. And I think that was it. So I can move on to the next one. This was another area that the Rural Resilience Subcommittee was looking at because of a charge in the Climate Action Plan, or in the GWSA actually, to look at fossil fuel reduction from a resilience point of view. And we've had a lot of discussion about this action and whether, or this pathway, and whether it really makes sense to combine it with the work that is happening in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, and they're looking at reducing fossil fuels to mitigate climate impacts. And so we have worked to team up with them to make sure that as the cross-sector mitigation committee is looking at many strategies and actions that pertain to what we have here. So looking at data, best practices to reduce fossil fuel use, equitably expanding access to programs like weatherization, like electrification, heat pumps, electric vehicle incentives, utility upgrades, that those are equitably accessible to all Vermonters. We're working with them to make sure that as they look at these types of strategies and actions, that resilience considerations are also at the forefront of their consideration. So you might think about weatherization, for example. You can do that to reduce fossil fuel use, but you can also do it to make sure a home can be comfortable and functional through a major storm or a flood, etc. That's it. Thanks.
All right, I think I'm up with the next two pathways. Hi all, my name is Bronwyn Cook. I am a Community Planning and Policy Manager in the Department of Housing and Community Development. So this pathway that we're looking at, pull up my notes. Get my Zoom out of the way. So our, I'm really sorry, I'm struggling here to get some stuff out of the way so I can see what I am talking about here. Okay, so our land use patterns, so sorry, this pathway is about land use and our land use patterns, which have a significant impact on our ability to build and maintain the infrastructure that does help us be more resilient to climate impacts, and to also preserve the ability of our natural and working lands to also adapt to climate impacts. So the concept here is that on the whole, more compact human settlement patterns can help people and communities be more resilient to climate impacts by providing critical services and infrastructure in a pretty resource efficient way. So thinking of, Anne was just talking about our wastewater management, our transportation networks, being able to provide those services in a way that's efficient and can be more resilient to climate impacts. Also protecting our natural systems that provide ecosystem-wide services. So thinking about our drinking water protection, floodwater retention, and even our natural resource-based sectors of our economy. So that compact human settlement enables that resilience of those types of landscapes. It also recognizes, though, that the infrastructure itself that supports this pattern of land use still needs to be resilient as well. And there's a lot of infrastructure in those compact settled areas. The group has been, so with the passage of Act 181, that's made a lot of progress in terms of our regulatory barriers to enabling more compact development and putting those resources into those places that allow us to be more resilient as communities. And so at this point, the strategies that we're looking at are really focused on investing the public infrastructure to support those land use policies that have been put in place, so that our existing structures can be more adaptive to, for example, flooding. Next slide. So this is a pathway on access to housing. So ensuring that all people have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing. And in our work group, in our discussions, yeah, I think it's easy to think about housing as like as an asset, as an infrastructure challenge, but this pathway is really about the human capacity for resilience. So it's providing housing as a way to make sure that humans are resilient. So housing is a basic human need. People who do not have stable, affordable, safe housing are going to have a harder time being more resilient to some of those other impacts of climate change that they're going to face. Really, Vermont can't be resilient if its people are not resilient, and especially if they don't have access to their basic needs like housing. So yes, we need to build our housing in a way that is resilient, but this is really about providing the housing that's needed. So the recent housing needs assessment indicated that Vermont needs somewhere between 24 and 36,000 more homes by 2029 to meet the demand. And I won't go into the details of it. It's a great assessment that looks at sort of our housing stock plus our demographic changes plus loss of housing, et cetera. But long story short is we need more housing units so that folks do have stable, safe places to live. Again, a lot of progress has been made with this in terms of removing regulatory barriers, making more types, making regulations more permissive of more affordable types, more compact types of housing. And so I think the next sort of wave of action to keep moving on this is really focused on, okay, we've removed some of the regulatory barriers, made it easier to build multi-unit housing that is in flood-safe areas. But now we need to support the contractors and the builders through training and through funding for home starts to actually start seeing the number of units increase in Vermont, rehabilitating housing as well. So that's the focus of the housing strategy.
Bronwyn, I think you were also.
Sorry, staring. Who's next? It's me. Still me. Okay. Sorry. This the last pathway is again back to the what Andrew was mentioning about recognizing that public health was really lacking in this conversation, is pulling in a pathway that does focus on the impacts to the climate change impacts to public health. So there's been a lot of discussion on, especially after 2 years in a row of flooding in central Vermont with the same, groups of volunteers, doing this work again and again, small businesses, losing everything and then losing it all again. The mental health impact of that. And so ensuring that there's mental health services for the communities that have been really impacted by the last 2 years of flooding. Also, just increasing public awareness of other health impacts like waterborne and vector-borne diseases. Making sure that people know swimming in our lakes and rivers in the first 48 hours after a flood might not be the best idea. And again, these are new things that folks may not be aware of because we have not been seeing the magnitude and the frequency of these kinds of events. Alerting people to days where there's high wildfire smoke and a high risk for especially those who are most vulnerable to particulate matter in the air, et cetera. So I think we're still really building out the specific strategies here. And again, we'd love to hear more from this group on what they're seeing play out on the ground in communities, especially in terms of health impacts and what can be done to help mitigate those health impacts. And now I think I get to pass it to someone else.
Hey everyone, I'm Liz and I'm supporting the cross-cutting pathway groups, which cover workforce development, education, and compact settlement. The idea being that there's representatives from each of the subcommittees on these groups, and they're also open to the public rather than being siloed in one subcommittee. There's participation across the subcommittees. So these are just some examples of drafted strategies of these cross-cutting pathways. So from enhancing a climate workforce to increasing investment in infrastructure need to support more resilient, compact, and walkable development here. Those are examples just pulled out of workforce and compact settlement. And then you'll see building codes here. That was in cross-cutting pathways in the initial climate action plan. And in the update, that was moved to, the Climate Council moved that to cross-sector mitigation where the expertise resides. And Rural Resilience has expressed interest in seeing codes in particular that account for anticipated climate hazards. These cross-cutting pathway groups are still meeting. The next meetings are taking place the first week of December. They're open to the public, and towards the end of this meeting, we'll be sharing out ways to get involved, and there will be links to access those meetings as well. But those are that's a snapshot of cross-cutting pathways so far. Next slide.
And I believe this is me. So thank you, subcommittee members, for sharing with us, all the work and all the thinking that you've already put into this. I think that's created a great foundation for the folks on the call that have joined us. We have about 40 individuals. I think that we want to hear from you now. We have almost an hour to hear what your reactions, your questions, your concerns, any thoughts you have that will help the subcommittee as they start to finish their work and refine these recommendations for the council in December. Before we launch into these questions, I have a question for you. So I would like to know a little bit more again about what your connection to these issues that we're working on today is. So what is your affiliation that brings you to this meeting? And I think we have a multiple choice question. Would love to have you quickly just check off the best way that you would describe your affiliation. And, this also includes private citizens and residents that may not belong in any of the other categories. So please, if you would fill this out, we'll wait for your answers. And while we're waiting for your answers, which we'll share in a minute, I'll move just quickly to talk about how we want to engage in this conversation to make it as smooth and get to as many folks as possible. We would like you to raise your hand, your virtual hand, which you'll see either at the bottom of your screen. There's either a raise hand icon that you'll see right away, or if you don't see that, it may be hidden under your reaction button. There should be a reaction button for some of you. Then you can click on that and it will have a raised hand function. One of those two is if you have any problem finding it, you can directly chat with Charlotte Goodman, who's here, and she can help you with any tech problems you're having. She'll help you directly. I want to share our results. There we are. So we have a fair number of people in state and local government, about half overall. And then really it looks like the rest of you are predominantly in the other category. And maybe as you're asking your question, you can share with us what that affiliation might be so we can get to know you better. Thanks. That's helpful. So as I said, we're going to ask you to raise your hand. Just to be clear, what our goal here is today is just to get as full range of perspectives as possible. We recognize that a lot of you have had very different experiences and have very different perspectives on some of these issues, and we're eager to hear all of them. So we want you to, when you do have a question or a comment, if possible, be as succinct as you can. Our responses will try to keep succinct so we don't take up too much space there. And then we also just ask and know that you'll be respectful in sharing your point of view and learning and listening to the point of view of others that may be very different from yours. Also want to let you know that we are going to be taking notes, both written notes and, we have a recording of this, obviously. Those notes are going to be shared with the rest of the subcommittee members who couldn't make this meeting. And they're also ultimately going to be summarized for the Climate Action Office's quarterly engagement report. If you don't want to speak, you'd prefer to put your comment in chat, that's another option for you. So just put it in chat. If I can, and we don't, there's room in between all the verbal comments, I will try to read out a few of those as we go along. So you see on your screen right now some specific questions that we're seeking feedback on. What support do you need most in disaster preparedness and response? And then in terms of long-term resilience planning, what kinds of help do you need, and what capacities do you already have, but also what capacities might you need to expand on or acquire? We're also interested in hearing how you would like to be better engaged, or how municipalities could be better engaged in both state, regional, and local resilience planning that's going on. And obviously, we want to know anything we missed. The subcommittee wants to know if there's issues of resilience and adaptations that you're either dealing with or you expect to deal with that they need to be paying attention to and being addressing in this plan. I see a bunch of hands already going up.
Catherine, I'm just going to jump in here. I'm going to stop sharing so we can just see each other all better. And I was hoping, or I can try to, or if somebody else can post those questions in the chat, that might be helpful.
Okay. I just did it, so we're good.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, so you'll see the questions in the chat, and let's go ahead and get started. I will try to take the hands as I see them appear. So John Sales, I see your hand is up, and then we'll move to Kale Romanoff. And could you just tell us what your affiliation is? I see
Absolutely.
you actually written underneath the.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Sales. I'm the CEO of the Vermont Food Bank, and I'm glad you're doing this. I'm happy to kind of start getting engaged, because I think this has been a little bit off our radar, and I think I'm answering the questions. I think the first question about disaster preparedness and response, and also what's missing, and to make sure that whether it's in this subcommittee or another one, that food security is part of our disaster or our climate resiliency planning. I think for this particular subcommittee, it fits in neatly in both Pathway 1 and Pathway 6. It really is about that statewide funding and statewide planning, and making sure that food security and food resiliency is part of that plan. And also under 6, this really is a public health impact, because making sure that people, whether it's in a disaster or just going forward with our climate change, with the climate changing, that people have access to the nourishing foods that they need to stay healthy and engaged. The last thing I'll say is there is a food security roadmap that we've been working on in a coalition. It's part of the Farm to Plate. It's a spinoff of Farm to Plate. And there are a lot of parallels it's a food security roadmap, 10-year roadmap to 2035. There are a lot of parallels with things that are happening in this climate action work. And I'd love to see those connections being made to make sure that we're really supporting and multiplying each other's impact. So glad to be here and glad to listen.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Appreciate the resources too. Kale, or maybe it's Kyle Romanoff, and then Patricia, you'll be up next.
You were right the first time. It's Kale, pronounced like the leafy green. I'm a staff attorney with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. They nominated me to join just because climate change is an interest of mine. I've worked on the climate action plan in the town of Underhill, and done some other work in climate areas. So that's why I'm here. My couple comments I had, though, mostly on the first 2 questions you had. The first one, the disaster preparedness and response. One thing we've noticed is that with the FEMA buyouts, with the flooding, they come along with a restriction on future development. And in many cases, that's exactly what we want, because it's a floodplain and there shouldn't be development there anyways. That said, that reduces the town's grand list. And I know it's been reported on the news at one point at least. Some towns are having trouble with that decision. You know, there's certain properties that are clear, like, yeah, don't let anyone build there again. We'll sign off on, because the town has to sign off on the FEMA buyout. The FEMA can't, the landowner and FEMA don't do it their own. The town has to also sign off on it. So some towns are having trouble with that decision and not granting it in some cases because they feel like it could be developed and they don't want to lose the grand list value. Those are narrow circumstances, but it might be worth considering a state option run by the state that would have maybe a stricter standard for when a buyout is allowed, but that may allow future development and gives the town an option to keep the property in the grand list for future development, but also allows the landowner to say, okay, this is not working for me. I would need a buyout. I can step away. Not sure how that would work, but just a thought. One thing that we're finding is some towns aren't granting the buyouts to their residents who have been impacted by the flooding because they don't want the property removed from the grand list. The second point I had was on long-term resilience. I mentioned that climate action plan that I worked on in Underhill. I think promoting plans like that to get towns to think about it broadly and to then incorporate it into their processes and policies would be valuable. So if there's an avenue for the state to support towns in that mechanism, or the Climate Action Council could do so in their capacity, I'm not sure. But it would be nice to see some promotion and support for towns to create these climate action plans. I don't think there have been too many towns that have adopted them yet. But kind of a similar plan to what that's being developed by the Climate Action Council, but on a smaller localized scale for each town, I think would be a valuable add. And those are the two points I had at this point.
Thanks for those suggestions. That's very helpful. Patricia, and then Kelsey will go to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Pat Moulton, and I am the Central Vermont Flood Recovery Officer working in the Agency of Administration. And I'm coming to you from my guest room, so I'm going to blur my background. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Appreciate the work that the Climate Council is doing and having this forum. And there are others who are going to be able to speak more eloquently to some of the points that I'm going to bring up. But clearly, one of the needs of the municipalities I'm working with, especially the smaller ones, are capacity. Simple ability to carry out the planning, the grant writing, the grant administration, the research that it takes to find the funding to help communities be more resilient. And with the frequency of flooding, I mean, you identified the volunteer work that Plainfield has. All of our long-term recovery groups, which are not appropriately named, they're really about short-term recovery, are all volunteers. And when you have multiple frequency or multiple storms, they get burnt out pretty quickly. But also our small towns, and VLCT and others can speak to this, have a lot of turnover in government officials, not necessarily the muscle memory from prior floods, and then simply an inability to stay on top of it all, not for lack of trying, but just there aren't enough people. So capacity is a huge issue. The other thing that I've been running into is towns, cities all need some modeling. Whether it's hydrology modeling, flood modeling, and some degree of predictability. And we lack really great tools to do that now. I have been working with the Lincoln Labs at MIT, who's got a fantastic new tool that would actually help solve some of that problem. But for a couple $1 million, Vermont could be the guinea pig that helps develop this tool and have us be the test case, given that we're in good shape with our LiDAR data and et cetera. And then the last thing I just want to make sure you're aware of is through the Recovery Office, there is work happening with FEMA around regional recovery networks, specifically starting in Southern Vermont to look at how we might plan for recovery networks that have some permanency. Chris Campany can speak to this, I'm sure, but Southern Vermont's going to kind of be the pilot for how we might do this elsewhere in the state. In addition, in Central Vermont, we're doing some watershed planning and having a convening on December 4th with municipalities along the Winooski watershed to start looking at how we share ideas, what's happening upstream, downstream, looking specifically at flood resiliency in that watershed planning. this is work that's happening now that you should be aware of. The work we're doing in Central Vermont is hoped to inform other watershed planning activities. So we're starting with these pilots to really start filling in some of the gaps of need, both on a network and information standpoint. So that's what I'm happy to share with you, and thank you for having this opportunity today.
Great. I appreciate those resources. I'm going to take Kelsey, and then I'm going to pause for a minute and see if any of the subcommittee members have any follow-up questions for any of our initial commenters. So Kelsey, you're up. It looks like you have a beautiful
Hi,
day.
I'm Kelsey. Yes. I live in Heinsberg. I recognize some faces. I was on the Just subcommittee for a couple of months, but then didn't have the capacity to stay on. But I figured this would be a way to share my input. So I was thinking about my community in Heinsberg. I'm on a very rural road, no cell phone service. And we had a couple of weeks, and I think the biggest challenge was over to get washed again a couple of weeks later. I'm like getting emotional thinking about it. And just the lack of resources, even from like the people who knew how to do it. And I don't know, like it's a good paying job, the town, whatever their job description is, like who plows the roads, like we had such a great turnover.
Kelsey, I'm afraid we have lost your audio. Maybe your poor cell service. We do want to hear from you, so maybe if you can rejoin us. It looks like we may have lost her entirely. So let me pause and see if any subcommittees have any follow-up questions or any comments before we keep moving on.
Catherine, I just want to, I think Destiny just put that she has to leave. So we do have a few minutes if she wants to.
Yeah. Sure.
Provide her
Thank you
comment.
for that. Destiny, you're next.
Hi, awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm the network manager representing the Vermont Environmental Justice Network. So we're a nonprofit that focuses on bridging the gap between vulnerable community members and like the state and federal decision makers. Most of what I wanted to address today was covered, so I'll just reiterate like what I've seen and heard is needed in our communities. I usually travel throughout Chittenden County, like mostly Burlington, Underhill, and Essex, and have worked with migrants and refugees, and we've talked about these things. So one thing that we've been dealing with, capacity has been a huge issue with our network as well. People truly get burnt out, like Patricia said. I think a lot of orgs are struggling with, you know, funding for staff and resources like grant writers, bookkeeping, work like that. So me and other networks, we're going to be trying to figure out how we can possibly share our resources, like maybe one grant writer for 2 to 4 orgs and pooling our resources to share together. You know, just for example, that's been a struggle. As for disaster preparedness, community education and training is going to be essential. So like, sorry, there's some loud stuff outside here. Providing like ongoing disaster preparedness education helps, like residents understanding emergency procedures or resources, informative workshops, and please, yes, accessible multilingual materials that can be like invaluable. So communities that are the most vulnerable to like climate issues like BIPOC, migrants and refugees, they really need language access, especially those communities in like the Neck area and Barrie, Bennington, even Burlington. Also, yeah, the communications about resources and education. I've heard a lot how people in communities often don't even know events that are happening or resources that are available, especially those migrant BIPOC communities. They need language access, they need community, they need to be welcomed and reach out to feel involved. Another thing I just wanted to touch on before I go real quick was about like the long-term resilience strategy. So I was just thinking about improved infrastructure, like you guys mentioned. So I really wanted to point out that the historical damage of Vermont's wetlands, we've lost nearly 50% of historic wetland area due to activities like excavation, draining, dredging, and that was found on the Vermont Natural Resources Council website. So we often need funding and technical support to enhance their physical infrastructure resilience. And I feel like we could collaborate with environmental groups such as ours to like plan and execute those restorations that also support the biodiversity of our environment. Okay, yeah, I'll pause there. Thank you so much.
Great, glad we got you in before you had to leave. Thank you for those comments. Now let me pause. See, and others may please get in the queue for your questions, but I wanted to see if before we get too deeper into some other topics, if you have some other, the subcommittee members have some comments or follow-up questions. Particularly for Destiny, if she hasn't left yet. She may have.
I don't know that I have anything specific for Destiny, but maybe, and Patricia mentioning capacity, it's definitely something that we talk about all the time and how to support that through funding and other resources. But I wonder if there's some ideas, and I think Destiny just talked about pooling some resources, which I think is a great idea. We're talking about that on a lot of different fronts, but just sort of ideas on what that looks like to add capacity. Is it people? Are there existing groups? Is there a new framework that needs to be set up, or just some thoughts on that? If folks have anything to contribute to that, I'd love to hear about that.
Any other subcommittees have some additional follow-up questions? All right, well, let's move to Claire Ireland.
Hi, thank you. Name's Claire Ireland. I'm here. I wear a couple different hats. So I'm here with the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, as well as I live in Waitsfield, and I currently serve as the disaster response coordinator, or I'm sorry, emergency management coordinator. I'm going to maybe defer my comments in that role because Alice Peel is also on this meeting, and she works in that realm as well. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of different points. First is just that, we've definitely experienced capacity issues. The fact that so many people are wearing multiple hats and trying to make all of this work happen has been a real challenge. So just highlighting that a lot of people are working very hard on these issues, and that if we can find ways to increase efficiency, like Desiree was saying, by potentially sharing resources and making sure we're taking full advantage of the existing systems that we already have, and making sure that those are funded appropriately and fully before we do things like recreate the wheel or institute new programs. So really doing that work of examining our existing systems and supporting them where they're underfunded currently. I also want to make sure that this initiative is working very closely with all the other state initiatives that are happening in Vermont right now. Hearing about things like floodplain restoration and flood mitigation work that needs to happen, making sure that that's aligned with work that's being done by the 30 by 30 initiative, as well as other initiatives that are aimed at preserving or even expanding agricultural lands, would be really important, because we have such limited pots of funds that we're working with. We need to make sure that all of our efforts are in alignment so we can sort of check as many boxes as we can with any given project that happens on the landscape. And I also just want to make sure that this is also being aligned with the work that's being done looking at county government in Vermont. I have worked in disaster response and management across the country, and the lack of county government is sort of a unique feature of doing disaster work here in Vermont. Not saying that we have to go that route, but it is a pretty standard way of approaching disaster response in a lot of cases. And in some cases, I feel like we do have projects that could be done at a county level, maybe more efficiently than trying to build them from the ground up through the municipalities. But yeah, thank you. Those are my points. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. And kudos on your multitasking there. You sway and can talk at the same time. That's very good. I saw a couple of hands from our subcommittees go up while you were talking. So Alice and Chris, if you want to jump in with some follow-up or comments from what we've already heard. Alice, go ahead.
Yep, I'm here. I keep muting and unmuting myself. Yes, first of all, I'd like to second everything that Claire just said about supporting floodplain initiatives to restore some floodplain areas, and also state initiatives not only to preserve agricultural soils and lands for local and regional use. I think it's important that the towns, when they do their bylaws and zoning, make sure that they are preserving and making good development decisions on prime ag soils so that they're there to be cultivated. And that's very important to the farm to table initiative here in Vermont. The other thing I'd like to say is public health issue comes to mind right away, in that when there is a flood that affects a farmer's property and floods their entire crops that they've planted and grown for the season, those crops are no longer usable. They can't be cultivated or sold because of the contamination from the floodwaters. And so it's extremely important that we are supporting our farmers who, an event like that can put them right out of business. And the other thing is that there are partner organizations out there like Vermont Land Trust, who's been working very hard in helping farmers preserve their farms. They also have a program where they preserve the farms and also preserve areas that go back to being the wetlands that they were. So it behooves us to really look at our land use policies and make sure that we're not reducing our agricultural or not supporting by funding and this kind of partnership our farmers. And I think there's an agricultural subcommittee that should be working on this also. But I just kind of wanted to point this out.
Thanks, Alice. Can you say what your affiliation is outside of the?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, and I missed my video here. Yes, I'm the chair of the Public Health Task Force, and I'm also a Waitsfield Planning Commissioner and chairing the new Regional Plan Committee for Central Vermont Regional Commission.
Thank you, thank you. And Chris, let's go to you next, another subcommittee member.
Hey, yeah, Chris Cameron, Executive Director of Wyndham Regional Commission, and among the RPCs, I'm the lead on both emergency planning and conservation. Three quick things. One is VAPDA, the RPC sent a note to the Legislative House and Senate, Government Operations and Human Services Committees, basically saying we really need to have a discussion about what Vermont's long-term recovery policy and protocols could be, should be for individuals and households. Because right now, for the 2023 and 2024 major flood events, or wider spread ones, we were fortunate that those met the FEMA criteria for an individual assistance declaration, but a lot of our disasters do not reach that. And so we need to think about, are we going to continue to kind of have a highly localized, volunteer-driven framework and protocol, or are we going to, and on the other end of the spectrum, a more coordinated protocol between state, philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, and others, or somewhere along that continuum. And the reason I bring it up in this context is one of the questions that keeps coming up is what is, or is there a proper role for the emergency management directors in identification of people with needs, what those needs are, follow up, that kind of thing. Because generally speaking, they have not played a major role, and that's not any fault of theirs. It's that we've not been designed that way. They've really been focused more on the public infrastructure side of things and other aspects. So it's just so the EMDs, the town municipalities need to be part of whatever conversation ultimately emerges, so that there is an actual defined role, even if that definition is there is no role. I'm not saying it should be one way or another. Another thing, two other quick things. One of the things that we did a 4-town housing planning charrette, which went through a public engagement process, and what we did was create kind of quick visualizations about where housing might be developed in towns that are out and away from, that are in appropriate areas, close to compact settlements, and out and away from flood hazard areas. We're going to meet with UMass Amherst again. We're going to talk to, they help support the process. We're going to meet with them on Monday to talk about really looking at how might we set up a model to do these kind of quick visualization processes to really focus on how compact settlements generally might grow up and away out of flood hazard areas. And ideally, though, this should also take into account becoming more wildland fire adaptive too. But the idea here is not to create necessarily a hard plan, but like just get the conversation going, because sometimes it's hard to talk about what that adaptation might look like without any kind of visualization at all about what that might look like. So that, and last but not least, I find municipalities oftentimes struggle with capital improvement planning. And there's some actual, and even like a basic one, like just bullets and best guesstimates of what things might cost. And the feedback we've gotten in the past is that they don't like to have a plan because they're afraid they might be held to it. And I get that fear, but it's something that we really need to look at and more fully integrate the hazard mitigation plan actions into capital improvement plan action, so that that can be approached through a more methodical process. Because one of the things Vermont probably needs to be thinking about is we're not going to be able to be as reliant on federal funds coming in. So we're going to need to better prioritize local and state funds to really try to invest in those capital improvements that are going to have the most impacts. And that's it.
Thanks, Chris, for sharing some of those parallel efforts and your comments. I'm going to go back to, we have a couple hands up now. Lori Kozar and Lena, you'll be next. But Lori, interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. I think you touched on a fair amount, and good to see you. I know there are a lot of folks on this meeting that I know. I work with the Vermont Community Foundation, and I'm the allocations director for the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund. So I'm coming to this conversation through the lens of recovery, disaster recovery, but also resilience and hazard mitigation. And what I'm seeing, and what I've been seeing since last July, when we were first flooded, was the challenge for a lot of municipalities as far as navigating the different systems beyond immediate muck and gut of homes, and having volunteers and neighbors turn out to do that. It's been a little bit of a stretch. And I think as far as the question about what do municipalities most need as far as preparedness and response, I do think other people have touched on this, is tech support with assistance in pursuing grants, being able to look at hazard mitigation. You know, a lot of towns have hazard mitigation plans that they've adopted. Those come out of the regional planning commissions and generally are part of FEMA's model of funding. The hazard mitigation plans allow municipalities to qualify for the National Flood Insurance Protection Program, another FEMA funded source. Better roads and bridges, upscaling those culverts and long and short span bridges, that plan has to be in place as well for towns to access stuff from FEMA. FEMA also funds fire safety equipment, fire department grants for either vehicles or safety equipment. So there's a lot of FEMA overlay, and it's not just a disaster when FEMA funds are available, but knowing those funds are available, helping municipalities be able to grant write. And I do think one other idea that was floated is this idea of a county system, and I think Pat Moulton mentioned this, and Chris, if I'm not mistaken, it's your region that's developing a pilot on a regional recovery network. And I think that that's not a bad model. FEMA models there, the threshold for individual assistance is, and FEMA funds is based on the amount of damage within a county. So lining those things up across the state so that we can access federal funds from FEMA or other resources, knowing how to navigate them, providing some training, and maybe it's, League of Cities and Towns providing technical assistance and grant writing for municipalities, and that could include hazard mitigation, resilience planning for communities. And I also want to say, when we talk about flooding, it's not just floodplains. I live in the Northeast Kingdom, and in Peacham and in South Peacham, we were talking about the sleepy little South Peacham Brook turned into a raging river and took out houses, and we lost a life down there of one of our neighbors. So it is upland flooding that is a challenge, and trying to figure out how to address that, and the hazard mitigation plans. The FEMA maps are out of date, and some of those are scheduled to be redone. But how do we map hazard areas and incorporate that? And I think that's something that municipalities could really use some help with. So I'll stop there. I could go on about this stuff, but I'll stop.
But thank you for sharing sort of the ways to facilitate access to federal assistance as well. Lena, you're up.
Thanks. Really appreciating this conversation. My name is Lena Greenberg. I'm a co-director at Community Resilience Organizations. I'm going to stay off video because my connection's not very good. So CROWS does grassroots organizing support. We provide technical assistance to grassroots groups across the state, mostly in central Vermont and the Kingdom. And we were approached by many of those folks after flooding in July to pull together what we're calling the people's demands for a just recovery from flooding. And I'm really seeing a lot of those demands reflected in the plan, and I'm so glad to see that. Part of what we were asked to do, and what we're now doing as what we're calling the Just Recovery Coalition, is really advocate for the short-term support that communities need, as well as the long-term change that will raise the floor. These are things like housing. These are things like supporting long-term recovery groups in a meaningful way and having them be part of emergency response. We've been hearing from a lot of folks about how much is placed on these incredible crews of volunteers in towns across Vermont. That's amazing. And also relying on volunteers is not that resilient, nor is it particularly fair. And really what I've been hearing from folks who have been on the front lines of recovery work is that we need a more comprehensive resilience planning process, set of resources, tools, and my organization is working on developing some of those in deep communication with the folks who have been really responding to flooding. And we have a community resilience assessment that we got to run in Johnson this summer as part of the VCRD community visit process, and thinking about tools like the community resilience assessment as a way for cities and towns and villages and clusters of folks to really look at their capacity for resilience, not just in context of disaster, but in terms of the broader social conditions that folks are living with. And just reflecting on a question the facilitators posed about communication, it's very, very hard to communicate with folks who are spread out and who don't have internet and who are not in the mesh with each other, and just really want to advocate for things like third spaces and community meals and library spaces and the kind of social infrastructure that pulls people in. Because when we have people already in some sort of relationship with each other, that's how information spreads. And we know that so much of the work we're able to do in this state is because of the relationships we have, that smallest unit of power. So really thinking about that as a component of climate resilience, even though it doesn't necessarily look like that on the surface. And just to close, I really want to advocate as well for the kind of regional government structures that other folks have been talking about, and really seeing this as a way to put power in community hands, right? Like, we know that because each little pocket of people in Vermont is distinct and has those distinct needs, we need to let those folks actually do their own planning, because they know best what they need in before, during, and after disaster. And then just one more thing, and then I will wrap up, I promise. Just hearing folks talk about funding and wanting to encourage anyone on this call who does distribute funds, whether that's from a foundation or through the state, to lower the barrier to entry, because especially the more volunteer-led work is, the harder it is to access those funds. And just really want to encourage folks to do some of the critical assessment of how much information do you actually need before you can disperse funding? How much more can we make those resources accessible to people who are on the ground doing that work? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lena. Really appreciate you sharing those experiences. I'm going to hazard a guess here. Betty, or?
It's actually Beata, and thank you so much for letting me speak. I'm an emergency preparedness specialist in the Middlebury Office of Local Health, but in a prior position, I worked in Virginia, where I managed a historic estate and had to work a lot with the Chesapeake Bay Act. And there's one thing that makes me think there could be room for improvement in Vermont. We hear a lot about floodplains, build out and preservation, and other natural sort of nature-based solutions. One of them that maybe it is here and I'm just not working in that field here, but a nature-based solution of having vegetated buffers on top of hilltops. They are very effective in preventing mudslides, especially shallow mudslides. So, of course, my daughter is a farmer, and I don't want to put any more asks on the back of farmers and loggers. But I think if there could be some sort of an incentive to have farmers, loggers, and others who want or need to get as much of their land as possible, but if there can be a way of giving them economic support for pulling back from the edges, so that we can have trees, shrubs, and grasses growing, about 100 feet, 200 feet from the edge to prevent mudslides. I think that could be something that could be very beneficial, and it might already be happening, and I just don't know about it, but I haven't heard much talk about it. So that'd be something I'd be interested in hearing more about if it's available. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll let the subcommittee members respond after I take the last question here from Eric Pulver.
Yeah, thank you for doing this and and listening to everyone in Vermont about updating the climate action plan. So I am, oddly enough, a counterpart to Beata. I am an emergency preparedness specialist for the Department of Health in Rutland. And also, I just want to mention one, I think it's an important issue that we kind of are running into quite often, especially in the recovery sphere, is that what I say is that we're trying to build a house, and a lot of this sort of work is happening is trying to build a second floor, meaning southern regional type work, but there's nothing at the first floor. And so, I think that's one of our biggest issues here in Vermont is we really need to build out that capacity. We really need to build out those collaborative efforts and really understand that, the term that keeps coming up is Vermontize a lot of this stuff, is that we don't have county government, we don't have regional government. And so there's no one really at that county-ish level that is working to bring all of these groups together. And so there's a lot of these really small pockets of amazing work that no one really knows about because there's no one to talk about it. And so I think that's a really big thing that we need to look at, is to build this resiliency, to build preparedness, to build response to climate change, and to all of the disasters that are already here. I think that local capacity and bringing all of the partners together is a really big thing that we really need to be looking harder at.
Really appreciate that. I just, we have like 1 minute if any of the subcommittee members want to respond to some of the comments we just heard. Yeah, Michael? We're not getting your audio, and I'm getting a little bit of feedback.
How about now?
Better, thank you.
Okay. Just wanted to respond. I'm a member of the Rural Resilience Subcommittee, and my position at GMP, I've had the privilege or unfortunate privilege of going through many recoveries in Vermont over the last few years with storm. And something Chris Campney said, I just thought I would weigh in there, and it was about the role of emergency management directors. And what we've done over the years is have created relationships with those people, and they have been kind of our conduit into the towns in these emergency events. Like I think about extreme flooding events, extreme wind events, extreme heavy wet snow events. And where I'm going with that is, this is for the health side of the rural resilience, is we're sending people home now that used to stay in hospitals longer for recovery, right? And we're getting calls now after an hour because people are being sent home with oxygen machines that don't have tanks, right? They just work off power, pull oxygen from the air and send it to the customers of ours. And what we're doing with those regional emergency management directors is we actually escalate those calls. We reach out to the local emergency management directors, and they are able to help us with those customers. So we're talking to our customers during every event. And that has been a really critical role over the last few years for those emergency management directors. They usually have contacts to fire departments, police departments locally. So just something to think about, Chris, when you are talking to those directors on exactly what role they can play. They become a great conduit for us talking to our customers. And then obviously just on the public health side of rural resilience is, you know, they used to have 2-day oxygen tanks, right? Now they have a machine that just plugs in with no backup capacity. So something to think about when we're helping on one side, what it's doing to customers in rural areas, specifically in these major events. Again, we talk to our customers during the normal times and also during the storms, and we're figuring out ways to help them, but just something to think about on the public health team as you move forward too. Thank you.
Catherine, do you want me to comment as a subcommittee member just to thank everybody for being here?
Sure, we're not wrapped up yet.
But so I'll just respond real quick to Michael's comment and really appreciate everybody engaging, and please keep engaging. Alyssa Sabeto, our emergency planner, actually kind of helped lead an effort to better connect GMP to the EMDs. And something else we may want to think about are, and this may be through EMDs, are rapidly deployable batteries. And I'm not talking like the power walls. Ideally, everybody would have one, but you know, like we have a couple at the house that I can take wherever I need to on the property. I actually keep one that I travel with now to support my CPAP machine. So if I'm at a hotel or something, I can plug that sucker right into the battery that I keep in the vehicle. But that may be another thing that we want to start thinking about, is keeping, like, you know, quickly deployable batteries in place that we can carry to and swap out for folk who have those special needs. Anyway, just something to think about.
Thanks, Chris. So I just want to acknowledge there's been a lot of sharing in the chat, a lot of resources being shared, a lot of comments. There's some wastewater information in there. So for the subcommittee member that particularly was interested in, this was more about the connection between compact development and wastewater. please, we will just know that we haven't been able to highlight that, but we will capture it and keep it. I want to do one thing to wrap up, before we go to this slide. We wanted to share a Menti poll, which is really just, so we're putting a link for those of you who are have done this before, you might know. Charlotte has just put a link in the chat. If you go to that link, there's a question there that we'd like you to respond to with a very short phrase. It will help us sort of prioritize all that we've covered. We're asking you to just try to kind of home in on what you think is one most important thing that you would like the subcommittee to take away and consider today. So if you could go to that link, you can start typing right away. Charlotte will share in her screen your responses so that you can see what everybody else is saying. And we just want to take a minute to let you do that. That's great. That's a short phrase. Efficiency, planning, community-led planning, more specifically. Coordination. Yeah, we've heard a lot about that. Coordination again, coordination. Great. I mean, we're starting to see some themes here, which is super helpful for the subcommittee. Building local communication, collaboration, coordination. I apologize. I don't know what EPO stands for. Extended power outages, I'm guessing. My utility background. Yeah, extended power outage. Yes, thank you. I see that now. Great. Keep going. Again, we're going to capture all of this and synthesize it a bit. So this will help us, as I said, just sort of get greater clarity on what rises to the top. So we're going to close the screen sharing, but that doesn't mean you can't keep writing. So please do keep writing. And the last slide we have is really just to tell you what other ways you can stay engaged and what's sort of upcoming in this process overall. So you can sign up for the newsletter, and if we can put some of these links directly into the chat so people can access them more easily. Obviously, we have these subcommittee meetings. If you go to the vermont.gov calendar for the Climate Change Council, that link there, that will show you exactly when all the subcommittee meetings are, when the input meetings are planned, if there are any additional ones. You can attend any meeting to learn more about how this is all being taken in and synthesized. Also, you can attend the council meetings, and wanted to bring to your attention the fact that the council, it has an upcoming meeting where they are actually going to start looking at this feedback and taking it in and reviewing it. So on that calendar, you'll see their upcoming meeting. And then finally, there's some ways that you can also share your thoughts outside of all of these meetings. I saw a comment saying, it's not always easy for everybody to attend these long meetings. You can share a comment through this comment form, or you can leave a message at the number that you see there. So we want to be able to make this as easy as possible for everybody to contribute your thoughts when they occur to you, whenever they occur to you. So please do take advantage of that. Think that's it, but unless I missed anything, Andrea.
No, I think that is it. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy schedules. I know everybody is incredibly busy, and for providing the input. I think a lot of what we heard aligns with what we're contemplating, and we've got a lot of good ideas from you today too. So I really appreciate you taking the time to provide that to us, and keep plugged into what we're doing. Like we said, the Climate Council will be considering these actions at their December meeting also, and then look for those more formal public engagement opportunities in the spring when there's a new draft out. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
And a great weekend. We're there.
Yes, that too. We're there.
Thanks all.